to you. Tim, the virtual floor is yours.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Right. I have a PowerPoint that I'm going to show you because there are a whole lot of slides I'd like you to see. I hate PowerPoints. So whenever possible, I'm going to break away and actually talk to you like a human being. So yes, my name is Tim Brookes. I am I would say, accidental founder of the Endangered Alphabets Project. Accidental in the sense that I'm not a trained linguist or anthropologist or linguistic anthropologist. And I really stumbled into this entire area by accident. So I'm going to start sharing my screen, having had a chance to see you like a human being. And we will take it from there. Okay, let me just get out of all the stuff that I don't need to be in. Thank you very much. Play from the start. Right. So as I was just saying to Mano, I realized yesterday that this is the first time I've given a talk about what I do to an audience primarily from the Southern Hemisphere. And this really stopped me in my tracks and made me refocus a lot of things. And it really, really helped. So you're actually hearing a talk that is entirely realigned for this audience. And I'm very curious to hear your thoughts and observations when we get into the discussion afterwards. And that's why I've added this phrase that the global North, global South, because that actually plays into this a great deal. So 15 years ago, as I say, I stumbled across the fact that the vast majority of writing systems currently in use in the world are actually endangered, no longer used for official purposes, no longer taught in schools, in some cases actively suppressed or banned. And I began responding to this in a strange way. I started carving pieces of text from these endangered scripts in wood, and then I exhibited them and I gave talks about them. I actually had no background in wood carving either, so this was an entirely new direction for me. And my first exhibition was a dozen different iterations of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And then I became steadily sort of more engaged and more activist about this. And so what we see here is I'm working with a scholar and the community in Sierra Leone, the Mende community. So they had, for a brief period, their own writing system called Kikakui or Kikaku. And it was essentially marginalized and pushed out of existence by the British colonial authorities. And we're sort of in the process of reintroducing it. And so one of the things that I did was to carve some village names. These are names of villages where the script was kept alive in English and in Mende Kikakui. And so this is a group of villagers and students and faculty who are extraordinarily excited to see their own script again. And this notion that a script is as important to its culture as that culture's dance or art or music really runs throughout all of my work. And it also shows how the Latin alphabet is very, very different because people who use the Latin alphabet don't feel the same affiliation because it's used so widely. In fact, by about 75% of people in the world as a primary or secondary script. So a couple of years ago, I started trying to pull all these thoughts together in this book, Writing Beyond Writing. And much of today's talk is actually sort of spinning out of there, and in particular, asking questions that include what is writing, which is by no means as straightforward as it seems. And while I was writing this book, I was very aware of the huge divide between the privileged West, as I saw it, and what I would call out among the endangered alphabets, which in my mind was this kind of vague geographical region, kind of like an archipelago scattered across the world. But what I've come to realize, in fact, is that rather than West and scattered archipelago, this is really very much a North-South issue. And that's the sort of the focus of what I'm going to be talking about today. And this issue that there is a divide in terms of scripts and writing systems between North and South becomes even greater if we look at this question, what is writing? And we include non-phonetic forms of writing, such as from the Andes, the quipu, the knotted strings, which are extraordinarily sophisticated systems for conveying information. They're by no means primitive, they're by no means just an abacus. The jikandi from Kenya, where you have this combination of performance and counter-performance, and you have a gourd, which is both a percussion instrument and it carries logographic symbols on it, which are made specifically for that performance. The mudcloth Bogolanfini symbols of Mali, and so let's not go to that one quick. And so this talk is really going to be about ways in which the global South is actually the most active and interesting area when it comes to scripts and writing systems and questions about writing and the future of writing in general. So the impulse to create scripts, to create new scripts, is a really interesting indicator of this divide. In the global North, when people create scripts, they're almost invariably for fiction. They're for novels, speculative fiction, science fiction, or they're for TV series, or they're for movies. And so here we have the Klingon alphabet as a great illustration of this kind of theoretical or fictional interest in new scripts, as opposed to the whole idea of scripts as new scripts as important cultural elements for an ethno-linguistic community. So roughly half of all scripts currently in use were invented rather than adopted or adapted. So the next time you see a kind of a family tree of this is where writing began and this is how it spread, it entirely excludes the inventions of scripts. And what is fascinating for today's talk is almost all of these invented scripts were created in the global South. It's this energy and creativity in terms of writing that I'm really, really interested in, especially for this talk. And in fact, if we look at the global South, we see an extraordinary amount of activity in no fewer than 4 different areas. One area, which you see less in Africa and more in India and Indonesia, is the continuing use of scripts that are specifically being used for ritual or sacred purposes. These are usually highly endangered, and often they're used only by ritual specialists, priests, shamans, etc. But nevertheless, they clearly identify a very, very important identity of writing itself, especially to that particular community. The second kind of activity that you see a lot in the global South is writing that tends to be referred to kind of condescendingly as kind of like a folk practice. And some of you, I'm sure, are familiar with the Adinkra symbols of Ghana. And by the way, when you see a carving like this is one of my carvings. And this is a symbol of 2 fish biting each other's tails, which is an exhortation to not do that, to live and work collaboratively and sort of maintain that family or tribal unity. We also see examples of traditional scripts that are being updated and adapted. So the Adinkra symbol system is in the process of being sort of reconceived as an alphabet, as are some others, CBD, for example. That is an activity which, again, is unique to the Global South. And then new script creation. So many of you, I'm sure, have seen the talk about Ditemar Dinoko from your area. So I thought I would bring in another one. This is from Burkina Faso. This is Gouls. And as you can see, sort of a little bit like Ditemar, it's extraordinarily interesting graphically. And it's also based on traditional logographic art symbols used on houses. So again, this is one of the many exciting changes that are happening disproportionately in the Global South. And especially in the last 10 years, I've seen an enormous amount of creativity and energy and commitment on a sub-national level, that is among small communities that may be underrepresented politically, or maybe a completely disregarded minority. And in many cases, they're taking writing beyond its standard northern definitions, hence writing beyond writing, and making it more local, more culture specific, less colonial, less imperial, and more true to the history and beliefs and aesthetics of their communities. So the weakness or vulnerability of this activity is that it's usually the work of individuals or very small groups. Now, there are exceptions, especially in Indonesia, where a number of individual provincial governments are recognizing that their traditional identity is invested in their writing system. So Sundanese was resurrected after 350 years of not being used in Sunda, which is the western half of the island of Java. And now it's being reintroduced because it graphically represents the history of the Sundanese people, as opposed to the Latin alphabet, which doesn't represent them in the slightest. And I include new scripts and these revival scripts in my definition of endangered alphabets, because they face so much inertia and so much opposition, especially typically on the part of national government, that they're like fledgling birds, until they've actually flown the nest and can fly on their own, the likelihood of their survival is very much threatened. So that's the activity that we're seeing throughout the Global South. But the opposition to these many small points of energy or light really comes from the Global North. And as a digital humanities program, I'm sure this is something that you think about and discuss all the time, which is how do we balance the promise of digital technologies, digital writing, AI, etc., against various effects that it brings with it. So, this leads me to think about the inherent beliefs underpinning the kinds of progress that are being touted especially in the language sphere, especially in the North. So on the plus side, of this whole kind of digital expansion, you have someone like my friend Craig Cornelius, who does extraordinary work with minority communities. He was responsible for developing the keyboard usage of Cherokee, for example, and more than a dozen other minority scripts. So the fact that you can actually now text in Cherokee is largely his work, along with the rest of the Noto Sans team. So that's clearly a an interesting issue, but it also is an interesting political issue because it means that for the first time in history, people who are members of a linguistic minority community um, are able to text somebody from their own culture using their own script and their own language. And this is particularly interesting and valuable for, let's see, I think I have to go back here. There we go. So we've just been joined by my friend Oren Yusuf, who knows this corner of the world extremely well. So this is an example of a people, the Zaghawa people, who live in Chad and Western Sudan. And up until extremely recently, if they wanted to communicate with each other digitally, they had to do it through Arabic, but they're not an Arabic people. And they do have their own script, which, with a certain amount of tinkering, is in the process of being digitized. And I spoke to the creator of this, the digitized version, who was actually crowdfunding for the expenses of creating the necessary app to be able to allow his people to be able to text to each other in their own script. And the idea that a minority people can communicate with each other without having to go through the script and language of the culture that historically oppressed them or overran them, I think is a sort of an extraordinary political revolution, linguistically and symbolically. And so now I want to move on to the fact that this is not just an issue of language. So I'm good friends with the co-founder of the Basa Bali nonprofit, which is now called Basa Ibu. So about 10 years ago, I helped them with a Kickstarter crowdfunder where they wanted to create an online dictionary. And this is pretty common in endangered language circles, the idea of documenting a language by creating a dictionary so that the varying usages and memories of the community can be pulled together in something more coherent. But it turns out that this is more potent than you might think. So they set up the dictionary, which they then converted to a wiki, and they had my friend told me that they would have someone like calling in, I'm a taxi driver and I want to add this phrase, which is, where do you want to be taken, or whatever. And so it really became a very engaging wiki, and it had millions of hits, literally. But more interestingly, during COVID, it became a kind of a conversation platform for people to talk about how they were surviving the pandemic, how they were using various strategies to stay sane, to get groceries, all this kind of thing. And it actually became a tool for social discussion and social change. And interestingly enough, the government was in favor of this because they too were trying to reach the people through digital means. But people, it's like, why would you trust the government kind of thing? And so this had become their platform, their machine. And it's got to the point now where it is sufficiently widely used and sufficiently valuable that they are actually, as we speak, this Kickstarter is running, this is a current one, to create an app so people can access it through their phones, because as with many areas in the global south, internet connection and even power are very patchy. So here you have just a sort of a wonderful example of how the digital revolution can be shaped and used through language for social good. And I have to say that Wikipedia and the Wikimedia Foundation are likewise doing that, because we're getting this sort of fragmentation where the internet was originally very English dominated and even more very Latin script dominated. But we're actually getting a significant growth in indigenous script Wikipedia pages. I've chosen the Balinese one. You can find the Sundanese one. There's, I think, at least 24 by now, and many more in process of development. So all of this is, this is my giving my 2 cheers for digitization. But the price of these advantages, and this is something that very few people are talking about, is the rapid decline in writing as a manual act and a manual art. So here we see classical Mongolian. This is actually Bayala, which is Mongolian for thank you. And classical Mongolian calligraphy is simultaneously identified as a sort of a treasure of world heritage by UNESCO, but at the same time, it's also extraordinarily threatened. The one area where it was flourishing was in Inner Mongolia, or as the Mongols call it, Southern Mongolia. And the Chinese government has now decided that Mongol children should learn in Chinese. And so this is becoming even more threatened, which is, to me, for the purposes of this talk, really a salient issue, because it is such a manual script. And it's also such an artistic script. So classical Mongolian is the only script I know where each word is inherently calligraphic. So there are 3 forms of each letter: an initial, medial, and final form. And the initial form of each letter always has some kind of flourish. And as you can see it here, the top letter, instead of just moving into a symbol, actually kind of goes down and around, and then it begins. And then the medial forms of the letters tend to be pretty simple. And then the final letter is always some kind of swoosh or swoop. So each word, therefore, is shaped, and it has this this element of form to that word, because of this practice of having different versions of each letter. So one of the things that I discovered about endangered alphabets in general is that because they represent minority communities, they're much less likely to have been rendered into type for printing, because it simply wasn't worth somebody's while, a colonial authority's while, to cast type for every script. I'm thinking of, say, British India in particular. And so the only script that was used in print form would be the most acceptable to the colonial authorities and largest and most used script. And all of the lesser used scripts, or the ones the British didn't like, just wouldn't be printed. And on the plus side, this meant that these scripts continued their handwritten identity, whereas every script that was printed, the letters increasingly would be shaped for the convenience of printing itself. In fact, one of the things about the Latin alphabet that most people don't realize is that it has been influenced by printing more than any other script in the world, to the extent that actually it's an outlier. It's an exception rather than a rule. It is the script that was shaped by the printing press. And so now, as we move into the digital era, the challenge is to say, how can we liberate the Latin alphabet from the sort of inherent limitations of the printing press. The other challenge is, so what do we do about all the other scripts that are more inherently manual? And so writing by hand creates writing that is an extension of the human body, a signature, an autograph, which actually the word autograph etymologically means self-portrait. So because of the way in which the hand and the fingers and the wrist represent the energy of the body in general, it means that your handwriting is literally different in different moods or at different times of the day. It also means that you have cultural variations, even in the ubiquitous Latin alphabet. And it really maintains that kind of historical sense that writing represents the culture and even the materials that were used for writing for centuries. And so writing in these global South minority scripts is more likely to be a representative of the human body. But then also writing is actually more likely to be practiced by hand in the global South because of the limited use of printing, because of the patchy internet signal, and in the global North, this is regarded as being an aberration, but in fact, it is actually obviously the historical norm, and it's that difference of perception that I'm talking about today. So the spread of electronic writing is without doubt having a devastating effect on the practice of writing by hand, the manual act, the manual art. And we see it in northern cultures already, where kids are learning to read and write on their devices at the youngest age. And consequently, they don't do the rehearsal and practice necessary to write in a consistent and attractive fashion. I know many, many people in their, say, teens or 20s who are ashamed of their handwriting, and as a result, they avoid using it whenever possible. Even though we know well through research that if somebody learns to write by hand, they learn more quickly, they retain what they learn better, because motor memory is engaged, not just visual memory. So really, there's every argument for writing by hand, except the fact that the digital revolution is making it quicker to type, to store, to duplicate, to transmit electronic forms of writing. But this means that the global South is now, here we go, the reservoir of manual writing. It's also the reservoir of a certain set of attitudes toward writing, namely the belief that writing itself is a manual act, it's a cultural act, it's a sacred act, as we've seen. It's an act of importance. And the digitization of writing, by the same token, makes it more, you could do a PhD just on this subject. Digitization of writing makes it more secular and more trivial, the act of writing. And so we're now at a point in history which is almost like a reprise of the spread of colonialism. The North is showing up with advanced technology and the promise or threat that if the South doesn't adopt it, the South will be excluded from the world of trade, of learning, of civilization. And yet, these are advances that come at a price to which the North is strangely blind. And we see these symptoms, but actually we kind of say that they're just the price of progress. So for example, in the United States, everyone is kind of going, how can I tell if my student has written their term paper or if it's been done by AI? How do I know whether this message I got on my phone is from a person or from a bot? How do I know if this stuff on social media is actually from a person it pretends to be? So all of these are what happens when you move from the very personal act of writing by hand to the very impersonal and anonymous act of writing digitally. And so here we have, this literally came in my email yesterday. This is an email supposedly from someone called Mackenzie Cahill. Who knows if it's actually from her? And it's actually trying to sell a program of using AI to create multimedia teaching materials. So this is kind of like, you teachers are worried about AI because you're afraid your students are going to use it for these purposes. But AI is really your friend. And I'm going to have a photograph of a young blonde woman holding a dog. Again, we have no way of knowing whether that is in fact Mackenzie Cahill, but it's all part of this package of north-south differentiation in terms of the identity and practice of writing at this point in history. And writing by hand certainly requires skill, effort, and practice. But writing by hand also brings out the best of what we have to offer. If you want to bring your best writing to the page, you have to think, and writing slows you down. And carving, this is how I learned it, carving slows you down still more, which is why I did enough thinking to write the book. And so here you have a very interesting attitude toward the future. This is part of the Balinese script writing revival. They're having a festival where people are writing on lontar palm leaves, and a competition, and they're relearning those skills. And to go along with this photograph, I want to tell you a story of something that happened just as I was finishing writing Beyond Writing. I got an email from a young woman in Java, in Indonesia, who was thanking me for the work that I was doing in terms of preserving and supporting the revival of traditional scripts. And she went on to say that she had found a cache of letters from her grandfather, who had actually been a soldier in the War of Indonesian Independence after World War II. And she was fascinated to discover these, and she longed to know what it was like, what they were thinking. Not only was what was war like, but what was he thinking in terms of the new nation he was trying to create. But she couldn't read them because they were written in Javanese script. And so her new project was to relearn the script. And so what you have a brilliant example there is what looks like progress backwards. In other words, a kind of progress that reunites people by generation, reunites people within their families, reunites people within their nation as a whole. And at the time, someone said to me, you know, this is a difference between East and West. You know, in East, there is much more of this sense of the importance of continuity. And in the West, it's all about leaving the past behind. And now my question to you is this an East-West thing, or is it also a North-South thing? Do people really realize that the adopting of digital technologies, especially in writing, is actually a means of separating the users from their own past and making handwritten documents by their grandparents, for example, something that they can no longer read. So literally this morning, as I was reading my New York Times feed, I was reading an article about how AI is being developed, but is also being legislated and understood differently in different areas around the world. And in Europe in particular, there is a very strong sense of wanting to introduce legislation that will make sure that we get the best of AI. And there was this concluding two sentences that I thought were really appropriate to today. So I'm going to quote them. AI nationalism is part of a wider fracturing of the internet, where services vary based on local laws and national interests. I would say national and cultural interests. What's left is a new kind of tech world where the effects of AI in your life may just depend on where you live. And that in itself, I think, is an interesting discussion between me where I live and you where you live. But I want to leave you with something that I say in Writing Beyond Writing, which is that I have, as a result of writing this book, I have come to think of writing as a gift. Not a gift in the sense of a talent, but a gift in the sense of a means of taking something inside, say, myself, something that is invisible to you, something that is evanescent, something that is intangible, namely a thought or a feeling, and making a gift of it to someone else or to someone's else. And even though this is spoken as well as written, this presentation is really my gift to you. And the discussion that follows, I hope, is your gift to me. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Tim. This was really insightful. I have a lot of questions that I really need to think about.
I bet.
But I see that there are also a few questions in the chat. So Tanya says on the print script. So what about newspapers? I know in India there are several newspapers in local scripts. When was this started? After the colonial period was over?
Yes, there's actually two really interesting questions there. I don't know to what extent there are still newspapers in handwritten in local scripts. I know that has happened. I don't know if it still happens. I think there are at least two examples I can think of, which is true. The second question that goes along with that, and also really touches on this notion of what is writing, is the fact that in Islam, the act of writing, especially in less secular Islam, if I can say that, the act of writing in itself is an expression of God. And especially in the extremely ornate Nazdaliq script, this is something that is not to be used for secular purposes. It's not to be abused in that sense. And so I know that in Indonesia, up until I think in the early 20th century, there were newspapers in the Muslim areas of Indonesia where the body type was printed in Arabic, but the headlines were written by hand, or presumably were written by hand and then printed by lithography or something like that. I'm really in favor of I'm not in favor of saying abandon all kind of writing technologies, but I'm certainly in favor of saying look at what is being done by the act of writing by hand, and look at what is being done by the act of printing or digitizing. And in particular, ask yourself, what am I trying to achieve here? And what am I doing if I assume that writing by hand is simply old-fashioned?
Cool, thanks. I see that I had another question or comment, perhaps. Maybe the advent of AI and the fact that exams have to be written by hand again, handwriting might become more important again in the whole world. And Johannes replies that he can barely read his own handwriting. So I wonder how long it will take to mark exams. I've actually marked a lot of exams that were written by hand, and you do get a sense on how to read these different handwritings. So this was more related to the AI part. Yeah.
Yes. So this is really, really interesting because it goes to show how quickly you lose something. So writing is something that in the days before kids had tablets and laptops, was something that was rehearsed literally every day. And it's only that degree of rehearsal that makes it attractive, consistent, even legible. Um, and so I think when people started saying, oh, I'll give my kid a tablet, or I'll give my kid a laptop at the age of 5 and they can learn to write more quickly, that was simply something that they didn't consider. That this is a skill that is very, very easily lost and is maintained only consciously by things like that Balinese script writing festival that we saw. The other thing that goes along with that is that one of the weird things about writing, and again, I talk about this in the book, is that somehow we've always had this belief that in the future we wouldn't have to write. So if you look at science fiction from the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, nobody is writing anything. Everything is done by face-to-face communication, by video screen, by, communicator, all this kind of thing. And it's as if somehow we've always resented the fact that we actually have to go through the manual act of writing. And so consequently, when AI came in, many people under many circumstances were predisposed to regard it as a chore. So, for example, I've got to write up this report. I've got to send out this email. I've got to do this marketing piece. And if you regard it as a chore, you want someone else to do it for you, or you want to mechanize it, or you want to robotize it. And so ChatGPT became the robot that would do the hard work of writing. So as long as we maintain the attitude that writing is work, then of course we're going to ask a robot to do it for us. And in that sense, there's a parallel between what happens in newspapers and magazines with the advent, with the rise of digital communication. And everyone predicted that they would all go bust because everything is being sent electronically. But what happened was that it was the low art forms that went bust. So it was newspapers which were only ever printed on the cheapest possible paper to disseminate news that really, really took a hit. And all the high-end magazines actually survived sort of as art objects. And part of my vision of the future of writing is that it continues insofar as it is viewed as something of value, as opposed to a chore or a necessity.
Thanks. Yeah, I really agree. I remember this is now a few years ago. My handwriting is seriously horrible, and I decided that I wanted to kind of fit myself a new handwriting so that I can actually read it again. So I got a course on improving my handwriting, and I
Yes, yes.
realized so it has improved a bit, but I simply don't practice enough, and I think that is really
Right.
that is really what's needed.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely. And I did very much the same thing. And I bought myself a calligraphy pen. So now every time, for example, I'm signing a copy of my book, or I'm doing something where I really want to represent myself at my best, I write in my calligraphy pen.
yeah, you focus. Yeah. So
Exactly.
Johannes has another comment more related to South Africa. He says in South Africa, it is often assumed that writing arrived with the Europeans, overlooking earlier forms of written communication, such as beadwork and wall patterns, which are not typically recognized as writing.
Yes, and that hence writing beyond writing. To me, the whole book is an argument to expand the European definitions of writing, because there are so many forms used all over the world that in many respects are more sophisticated than alphabetical writing, which have for centuries been regarded as being primitive or childish or whatever. And this is, it's really just a self-justification. It's like we can we can conquer these people because we are superior to them. Our writing is what we use, therefore our writing is superior to them, and we're doing them a favor by teaching it to them. And really all that meant is that the nature of writing increasingly narrowed. And luckily, what's happening right now, anthropology in particular, is doing a phenomenal job of identifying other communication or meaning systems that are being used. And of course, when given the chance, and our children were first at this, we are reincorporating graphic symbols into our own writing in the form of emoji, the most rapidly growing sector of the Unicode. And the fact is that a visual symbol is way better at conveying instantly some kind of emotional material that would take many words to write out. So yeah, there really is. It's a fascinating time in history for that reason.
Yeah, no, I agree. I was actually wondering during your presentation, what exactly is writing? So is it the putting characters on, for example, a piece of paper? Is it kind of constructing a text? Or is it trying to convey meaning? But if it's just trying to convey meaning, is music then also writing? Um, it, yeah. So I'm not sure if this talk was about this, but it really made me think. What do you see as writing?
This is the question that I spend most of my time on these days. And I have several different things to say, and I won't be able to do justice to any of them. So, one, the word, if you take the word writing, you take the word music, and you go back 100 years. So, 100 years, 125 years ago, the most popular forms of music in the West were military marches. And their understanding of music was very defined by certain instrumentation, certain tonalities, certain rhythms. In many ways, it was extremely narrow. And music has undergone this revolution over the last 125 years, where now it's much more universal, much more Catholic in the small c sense. And the word writing has not yet undergone that expansion of value. Secondly, in addition to the various things that writing might be, that you just said, which are all are great, I actually have, I started thinking a lot about writing as a form of performance. And I have another interpretation of what is writing, which I gave in a talk to the Sign and Symbol Research Group a couple of months ago, where I think about writing as a mental act. So again, if you regard writing as a gift, then the formation of something visible, whether it's a sketch, whether it's a doodle, whether it's words, blah, 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 is is in a sense the end product of what you have done to create something in your mind. And what that really means is that the written word is not writing, but the aftermath of writing. So I'm thinking about Shakespeare, for example. What has come down to us, what has survived to us, is the written word. And we say, this is the pure Shakespeare. This is the stuff that we have. But actually, it was very unusual for plays to be written in any formal sense, and certainly not published in his day. The act of writing was an act of imagination, which included music, for example. So most of his plays have some kind of dance, and they have songs in them. They have, choreography. They have sections where the clowns would have been given a scene to extempore, to improvise on themselves. And in that sense, Shakespeare's imagination as a writer is much, much broader and richer and more interesting than what has come down to us, which is simply the aftermath of the writing process. So, yeah, I think we could have another hour's discussion, maybe more if I don't have to leave and catch the ferry, on which of these things writing actually is. But I would certainly say that this is also a north-south issue, because the books that I've read about writing, especially in Africa, actually, is how frequently it's part of performance. It's not writing in the sense of something that you see on a piece of paper and consume on your own. It's much more likely to be something that is public, maybe collective. The writing may actually be written by hand in the air. It is something much richer and multidimensional and more active and alive than what printing has given us. And I've got time for one more question, and then I'm sorry I have to run.
Okay, wonderful. Now you mentioned that. I quickly see a comment from Langa talking about writing and the representation of self. I often handwrite at very important meetings what I want to remember because I retain it better than typing.
Exactly.
You mentioned that for which I retain or remember very little. So for me, typing is a mechanical, fast process of representation, and handwriting is representation of that which becomes part of me. I
Precisely.
also see that Benito has had a hand up for a long time. Benito, do you have a quick question? Because then we need to stop.
Yeah, I can quickly just say thank you to Tim. It's a very thought-provoking talk on this afternoon, even a bit emotional to think about how we don't write. And it just made me think it's not 100% a question, just linking with what he said about basically your energy going into the way you're writing. And I remember Rory Sutherland telling a story. So he's a marketing executive at Ogilvy, and he tells this story about a young couple who just had triplets, so they wanted to buy a bigger house, and they wrote to people living on a specific street they wanted to buy a house. No, there was no houses for sale on that street, but the couple they wrote 7 letters, I think, by hand, and they were invited to 5 houses for coffee, just to come and see the houses. And by the end of, I think, that month, there were 4 offers from people on the street.
Yep.
And it was, I would also very much argue that, the energy, the effort that went into writing those letters definitely swayed people, because it wasn't like this chain email you don't even read the subject line of. It's written on expensive paper by hand with an expensive pen, and that whole thing of it becoming art and not a burden.
Exactly. Yeah, couldn't agree more. I'm so glad to finish on that note. Thanks so much for that story. And I'm so sorry I have to run. This is the price of living somewhere where my life is run by a ferry schedule. This has been a huge pleasure to me. Please send me more questions by email. Menno's got my email address. I'd love to hear from all of you. And I'm sorry I have to dash.
Yeah,
Take care.
Please reach out. Okay, thank you very much and have a good trip. Thanks.